Hello, I'm Diane Soumilas, the Council's Gallery Curator and Coordinator. Welcome to Eira at Home, this online conversation with local artists Simon Lloyd and Tony Scott. Eira City Council acknowledges the Boonwurrung, Winurong and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians and pays respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to land and waterways and extend our respect to all First Nations peoples. I'm delighted to have artists Simon Lloyd and Tony Scott as special guests for our online conversation today. They are joining us from their home studios in Ormond and Caulfield in the city of Glen Eira via Zoom during this extended lockdown. We are looking forward to seeing their individual exhibitions, Simon Lloyd, Confines of Being, and Tony Scott, New Health Plan, Project 10, Back from China, coming up in the Council's Gallery, and today discussing and providing an insight into their artistic practice, careers, and specific works to be featured in their exhibitions. So Tony and Simon, you've both had fascinating careers over many decades. Tony, I'll go to you first, read out your bio, and then ask you to share some highlights from your amazing creative journey. So in an impressive career spanning more than 4 decades, artist Tony Scott has staged many solo and group exhibitions, nationally and internationally, and his work is included in many public museums and private collections around the world. After studying art in the 1970s, he lived and worked in Beijing, China from 2004, and then briefly in Hong Kong before returning to Australia in 2016. He has been preoccupied with themes of memory and nostalgia, landscape concepts of body and time, and is accomplished in many mediums, including painting, mixed media, installations of sculptural found objects, and LED light boxes. So, Tony, can you share some highlights from your creative journey with us today?
Sure, Diane. I was trained as an art teacher and taught for many years. I left, as you said, teaching in the 1980s, and in 1994 was offered an exhibition in Beijing in China, which moved me on a new trajectory of my art practice and development. I arrived in Beijing at that period and found it an extraordinary and fascinating environment to be a creator in. The society was changing dramatically, so I stayed there for 9 years working and practicing my art. Moved to Hong Kong briefly, as you said, for 3 years, went down to open a gallery in Hong Kong and also continue the practice of my work, and then returned to Australia in 2013 and have been working here since then.
Thank you, Tony. And Simon, now we'll just read out your brief bio and then I'll get you to share some highlights from your creative journey. So Simon trained in three-dimensional design in the UK and exhibited widely both nationally and internationally since 1979. Simon has received many commissions and awards for his design work, including ceramics. His work is included in major museum collections in Australia and overseas. In addition to his design practice, he works fluidly across many mediums, including painting, photography, and more recently, video, bringing together elements of form and colour and investigating often unseen details in the urban environment. Simon teaches in the School of Design and Architecture at Swinburne University. So Simon, can you share some highlights from your career?
Thanks, Diane. Yes, at 18, I found myself living in the Battersea Road in London. This was a course at the London College of Printing, so what they call a foundation course. And at the time, Tom Eckersley was the head of that department. So he was the guy who did all these wonderful London transport posters and the Keep Britain Tidy, things like that. So really, at the London College of Printing, at the Elephant and Castle, I discovered the third dimension, which was rather wonderful. So this was a competition for Woolworths one-room living, and I made this piece of furniture. So from that point on, really, I had wanted to be a graphic designer, but that had changed. And so I moved to High Wycombe, the college there, which was then the head of the central area for furniture production in the UK. And in the first year, we had this really incredible kind of resource of different disciplines to work in. So photography, silversmithing, textiles, visual studies, you name it, ceramics as well. And I think that really set me off on this track in design, really looking at all these different materials. And that was a really kind of rich time for me there as well. So I moved to Melbourne in 1984 and then really began to work as an independent furniture designer and later worked with Melbourne designer Peter Sands. And it wasn't really till 2011 that then I became interested in painting as part of my design practice, really. So the painting is just another way to explore kind of other areas that relate to design and also, I guess, are more sort of independent as well. So my first exhibition was in 2011 at the Anita Traverso Gallery in Richmond. And I really enjoy this kind of exploration of things, and you can never really know where it heads to or goes to once you begin this practice.
Thanks, Simon. And you're incredibly fluid in so many different mediums, and we'll see more of this in your upcoming exhibition, Confines of Being, which will feature a selection of paintings, photographs and videos created over the last 10 years. And your exploration of themes around the urban environment, architecture, and your fascination with the discovery of unseen elements in your surroundings and the complex strata of rich colours and surface textures. So can you talk a bit about some of the main themes that you're exploring in your work and what we can expect to see in your exhibition, starting with relief painting with Channel 2011, which is from your first exhibition of paintings, and then after that, blue overlay number 7.
Yeah, so I suppose like a lot of artists, designers, it is this notion of observation that really intrigues me, and particularly things in our environment that maybe often go unnoticed. So this particular series, this is one of 7 paintings. In fact, these are my first paintings, as it were. So these were based on found objects, particularly packaging, and I found it intriguing that these artifacts that we have around us or we see have been designed by somebody else. They exist, that they're around, and so they have a life of their own, as it were. And so I was really just kind of pulling out sections of these, and somebody actually has observed, looking at some of these paintings, that they're actually more like constructions in a way. And I suppose this is my kind of design background. So these works are isolating details of this, in this case, packaging, and then constructing things around it. This second painting also employs a certain amount of construction, although this may be much freer. So obviously looking at kind of architectural themes. And here I've been kind of collaging or placing, in this case, plywood onto the surface of the canvas. So there is a sort of a cross-referencing of a plan and elevation, the way we look from above or the way we might look in a different direction. So I kind of enjoyed this, and obviously working from architectural references and photographs. This is a much more, I guess, painterly view, but it also has this kind of constructed element to it as well. And all of the work going later into the photographs and videos are really about observing the details. And I think in terms of scale, often you can home in on a little tiny detail in the corner, which could be, it's very Japanese, I suppose, a bit like the bonsai, but it could be a whole world in its own right. And I really enjoy the kind of the richness of our environment.
Thanks, Simon. And now moving on to a photograph, Hong Kong, that you created in 2019 during a visit to Hong Kong, which is really interesting in the way it references the urban environment and also provides, that sort of complexity and detail. which, you often refer to in your practice. So if you could talk a bit about this particular photograph, and then we'll bring Tony into the conversation and ask him to reflect on Hong Kong and how this has influenced his work.
Yes, this is actually my first and only visit to Hong Kong. And I think, like any city, it's an incredibly kind of vital and rich visual place. It's extraordinary, particularly in Hong Kong as well. There's so much going on, and also it's a very different culture. So I think I must have taken thousands of photographs during this trip, and just walking around. So this was an image I took one afternoon, and sometimes I often think, you can go out to try and capture images or places, but so often they kind of come to you, they make themselves aware to you, so you somehow have to recognize it. And this was one particular shot. It's very hard not to be able to kind of capture an image in Hong Kong, but this particular one struck me with these kind of covered walkways here. And the quality, the detail of the buildings, and this little capture red here, which is actually the McDonald's in Hong Kong. And what I like about these images often is that you see things in them later you hadn't recognised to begin with, just little details in corners. So they become almost like a whole landscape to be explored. And I really enjoy this kind of notion that there is a kind of a hidden depth to things in a way. And one image that actually isn't in the exhibition, but I was looking at a whole wall of apartment buildings, and suddenly the sun came out, and two smaller buildings were just kind of captured and spotlit, and by the other buildings kind of blocking out the sun. So these very dramatic kind of visions can appear and quickly disappear as well. But it's an extraordinary place.
Mm. And this is a wonderful photograph, Simon. So, Tony, can we bring you into the conversation now, and if you could talk a bit about how Hong Kong has impacted on your work?
Yes, this is a terrific image to talk about that Simon's captured here. The density of Hong Kong, the urban density was extraordinary. I thought it was dense in Beijing, but the southern Chinese cities like Hong Kong and Shanghai and Guangzhou are incredibly dense. You'd walk out and there'd just be this cacophony of concrete and surfaces and images that would assail you. So I found a lot of the work. Well, when I was in Australia, I lived in this ideal situation where I lived in Brunswick and worked in Fitzroy and walked to my studio. Then in Beijing, it was much more intense. But Hong Kong, I was not quite prepared for how extraordinary, complex and intense the environment was. So this concrete, this, as I said, cacophony of everything going on around you, people. My practice, well, as I said, I came down to open a gallery, but I took a warehouse in the old Chinese section, Shungwan, on the island, and found visually it was so stimulating. I did not that much painting and a whole lot more installation, collecting of material and visions, images. I did a lot of photography, but it was quite a different proposition than producing art in Australia and even in mainland China.
Thanks, Tony, and we'll hear more from you a bit later. So, Simon, just to talk a bit more about your interest in photography as a medium and how you utilise this medium to capture details and textures in the urban environment. So we're going to bring up image number 4, platform. If you could talk a bit about that, please.
Well, again, I think this is another one of those wonderful examples of these things which are in plain sight. You know, this is some a bit of topography on a station platform, and I'd seen this many times, Sometimes I've forgotten to bring my camera with me, so I have to return to the scene. But they're just these kind of really rich moments. And I was thinking about the English painter Paul Nash in the 1930s. Actually had a camera that he would just take a series of images that he thought were interesting, and then he would take the film down to Boots the chemist to be processed, and the same with David Hockney. He'd pop his film down to the local chemist to be processed, and so that kind of immediacy is fantastic. But really, the richness, and again, this relates to the kind of more abstract painting maybe that I'm interested in. You're looking for a particular quality through the lens, so you're framing all these details as you go along. And I think a lot of the closer details relate to that. And back to my design practice as well, it's about getting a kind of a harmony working within that frame, within the lens. I often work in a reductive way, so you're kind of drawing into the image further and further, or kind of cropping things out. So it is always making the decision about what's in that frame. And I guess as we walk around as well, we have this capacity to look in different directions, but we can only focus on one thing, which is really fascinating to me as well. So we have to have this connection. And of course, what we see is what we think as well. So there's a direct connection between what we're looking at, our environment, and what we're thinking, and I guess how we're feeling as well. So it is I think it's a very profound way that we are observers in these urban and natural environments as well.
Thanks, Simon. I love the detail and texture that you've captured in this photograph.
Thank you.
And now we're moving into your video practice and some footage from a circus video you filmed in the UK back in 2018. So here we see you engaging with place, memory and sights in your video practice. Can you talk a bit more about this circus video, and then a little bit about Low Tide Humber Bank, which you also filmed in 2018 during your time in the UK?
Mm. Well, this is really quite serendipitous in a way. I mean, the fact that I bought a camera that has capacity for video, and then a trip back to the UK. So for me, this is a very, well, you wouldn't say necessarily nostalgic, but always going back to one's roots, as it were. There is a kind of an intensity somehow of the whole environment. And rather like the photography as well, you have to kind of capture the moments. So this was a place where we were staying, an Airbnb in Lincolnshire on the East Coast. And they'd bought a circus tent so they could run children's parties. And that hadn't quite worked, so now it became a donkey sanctuary. And this particular morning, the white horse there wasn't supposed to be in this paddock, but it kind of got in. And so at 6 a.m. in the morning, this is the scene I was confronted with. So there's this kind of surreal moment of almost as if the horse has broken away from the carousel in some way. But also for me, this rather extreme Englishness, the bird song, this very lush green environment. And I think it's often about just capturing these moments. There were some other ones. We went for a walk in London along the Thames, and again we just happened upon a fox that was sitting contentedly in a substation, just minding its own business. So there's little moments that exist everywhere, but we don't often see them. And I think that's the really kind of fascinating thing, particularly with video as well. I mean, these are all still, they're all handheld, but I'm not moving the camera here. And I quite enjoy that as well, that the camera isn't so active in its movement, but is a static observer, and the things then happen within the frame as well. And that really kind of fascinates me. I suppose the second one, the Humber Bank. Again, this is one kind of lunchtime, coming to the edge of the river here. I grew up on the coast a little bit further south, but again, the way that the landscape changes so rapidly from high tide to this low tide, there's something quite beautiful about that transition. It's slightly grey. I mean, usually the sun does shine in Lincolnshire, but again, this kind of mood, the reeds there, the movement of the reeds and this mud, and this rather dangerous almost, all these tales of people crossing the marshes on stilts and things like that. So there's a deep kind of folklore almost about it. And certainly along this coast, there are many clay pits which are now kind of lakes. So this area, I don't know when it would start in, maybe in the 16th, 17th century. A lot of the bricks for this part of England were certainly mined from the banks of the Humber in this region. So they're really, I don't know, they're quite fascinating for me to be able to capture these almost extreme elements about this, from what is for me this very rich landscape and culture.
Thanks, Simon, for sharing some insights into what we can see in your upcoming exhibition. I'm really looking forward to seeing all the work. And now to you, Tony. Your survey exhibition coming up will feature figurative paintings, landscapes, mixed media works and sculptures made from found objects, which reference your long-term fascination with Chinese culture, themes of memory and nostalgia, and a preoccupation with concepts of body and time. Can you discuss the first work that we're looking at, Self-Portrait as an Acupuncture Chart from 2000, and your ongoing interest in medical themes and acupuncture?
This is a good work to start with, Diane. It probably contrasts with the work I was known for in Australia before I left for China in 1994. I was working in Michael Waddell Gallery, Meridian Gallery, Reconnaissance Gallery, as an geometric abstractionist. I'm not a figurative painter, and there was no figuration in the work. When I got to Beijing in 94, I became completely fascinated with the markets and the bazaars and what you could find down there. The culture seemed to be it was in complete flux of changing and emerging from many years of darker times. And there was a market called Panjiayuan, which was actually the eastern end of the ancient Silk Road, where they would unload the camels and horses at the eastern gate of Beijing. It was the most extraordinary and fascinating place to go down to. Not only was it showing, selling antiques and bric-a-brac, but also it appeared the changing culture, elements of the changing culture. So I'd had a lot of natural therapies and acupuncture in Australia before I left. And down there I came across all these old acupuncture charts, medical charts, fascinating objects that I decided were going to become part of my art produce at that time. I very much see my art work as my visual diary. So seeing as I was now in a totally different culture than my time in Melbourne, my work just had to reflect that. So I used these old acupuncture charts. I stuck them down on board or canvas. I really enjoyed painting over them or staining them, and a lot of sandpapering back to get these images, which suddenly I saw as a metaphor for my travelling and my journey in life. So this little figure kept reappearing in a lot of the charts I picked. And yes, I just use it as a metaphor for me and my journeys.
Thanks, Tony. It's a fascinating work. And now we're moving on to a new work, Mooncake Balance, which is where you're experimenting. It's an experimental sculpture which combines found objects, so a mooncake mould, brass plumb bobs and brass brackets. And here we see you exploring themes of measurement, balance and time. As Louise Guest has written in her excellent catalogue essay for your exhibition, the sculpture plays with ideas about how things are weighed and measured, literally and metaphorically. Can you elaborate on some of these ideas?
Yes, the found objects and again, as I said, detritus of a rapidly changing society became more and more evident in my work. This mooncake mould, they're the most beautiful objects of lumps of wood that have been carved to be the moulds for the mooncake ceremonies, which of course are important cultural practice in Chinese culture. I also found all these leftover elements of building industry or traditional work like plumb bobs and different tools that I just started collecting. I saw them as beautiful examples of nostalgic remnants of a change in culture, and they just became such beautiful objects. I wanted to put them together in various installation and sculptures. The traditional Chinese brackets came off old frames I found actually in Glen Huntley Road in Caulfield. They're new elements, and of course the brass wire from my local hardware store. So this I put together about 6 months ago, and I just thought it was a lovely example of the two cultures and my journey and putting together elements to have memories, personal, and hopefully people will find them lovely objects as well.
Thanks, Tony. Now we're going to look at another work, Red Landscape, Chinese Landscape from 2020, which is a combination of oil paint, pigment, wax on Chinese paper. So the landscape, but especially Australian and Chinese landscapes, are an important theme in your work. This particular work here combines Chinese materials such as gold and silver joss paper and is embedded with cultural meaning, layers of memory and references to the landscape, weather patterns and Chinese ink painting. Can you discuss this a bit more and perhaps elaborate on your relationship with the natural world?
I grew up in the Yarra Valley as a child, and my memories were always of long hours out in the bush, in the country, in the fields. So the landscape just keeps reappearing no matter what I do, whether I think of myself as a geometric abstractionist or an installationist or found objects, the landscape always reappears in everything I'm doing. This work, I was using the beautiful Chinese papers, these gold papers, and laying them down on cardboard and canvas. And then I'd studied, when I got to China, I'd studied traditional ink painting, and I love the philosophy that part of the process of doing the work was to allow the materials to have their own life. So I mixed pigment in different mediums, lacquer thinners or terps, and poured them onto these papers. I found by waxing the papers, the materials would separate beautifully or evolve beautifully, evaporate is what I'm doing, evaporate. And so this landscapes just started appearing. I could manipulate them to a point, but basically the whole idea of a work like this is to allow the mediums to dry, emerge, develop, evaporate as they wanted. So to my amazement, sometimes they look like more traditional landscapes, sometimes they just evoke a Chinese landscape. And this work just keeps emerging through all my career. I enjoy this work.
Thanks, Tony. And now we're going to discuss Shelter, which is an oil painting from 2019. which is part of a series of works created on Chinese almanac pages collected in Hong Kong and China. And it's also embedded with references to forms as a visual diary, which is something that is closely embedded in your practice. Can you discuss that in a bit more detail?
This work continues. This is a combination of found objects and the narrative of where I am and where I'm travelling. The underneath the papers are old Chinese almanac pages that I'd find again in markets or in shops. I would adhere them to boards or canvas and sandpaper them back so that the image almost disappears. It's like evoking a memory. Because again, in contemporary China and contemporary Asia, there's this contrast between tradition and 21st century society. So I wanted them to disappear into the back, that you can see the aspects of pouring over the top. And then these shapes, these geometric shapes that always sit on a horizon, remind me of shelters, specific shelters that perhaps one can hide in, evoke security. And I like them sitting there as quite a contrast to the very washed away surfaces behind them.
And they're like containers of memory, aren't they, also?
Yes, I think the whole idea is to evoke both a memory and a journey of where I've been, and perhaps the solidarity of the geometric shapes, which is just me enjoying painting. Reasonably realistic is the shape, but to combine. The geometric shapes appeared quite recently, last year and this year. The materials were collected over a 10-year period.
And we see more of the geometric shapes in the next work, Storm Over Seven Shelters, which is a richly layered and powerful work which evokes the snowstorms you experience, which would sweep into Beijing from the north. And the geometric shapes in the foreground represent shelter from the storms.
Yes, this one very much reminds me of most of the time in Beijing, I sat in an 18-floor apartment with a big picture window that looked out into the north, and you'd see these extraordinary snowstorms or dust storms coming in from Russia or the Gobi Desert, and so the pouring over the top is a reminiscent of that. They're actually done, this series of works actually done on digital prints of taken from Song Dynasty scrolls of sections of calligraphy, which I thought had a nice base underneath coming from China. And the geometric shapes again. I think at that stage I was ready to leave Beijing after 9 years. So the shelters, the geometric shapes represent stability or sheltered. I must have had in the back of my mind it's time to move back, if not to Hong Kong, probably to Australia. But this work begins a whole series of cloud and much more distinct pouring and emotional landscape work.
Thanks, Tony. And now, finally, Gardening in Caulfield, number 3, which is an oil painting on paper. So you've been creating a series of amazing paintings inspired by your garden studio in Caulfield since returning from China 3 years ago. And this series really evokes a renewed energy and a passion for nature and gardening, combined with richly textured oil-painted surfaces and collage elements from Japanese and Chinese wallpapers. It's a fascinating new direction for your work, and for me it sort of resonates with ideas around place and home. So can you talk a bit about what gardening represents for you in terms of your practice and your sense of place?
Yeah, I'm not a figurative painter, never have been, as I've said. So these works are very expressionistic. And yes, they're about being back in my beloved environment of the garden and working with nature and gardening. I guess referring right back to growing up in the Yarra Valley. But I really enjoyed being back in my studio in Melbourne and being able to push oil paint and oil pastel around. And my studio is in the back of the garden. I resurrected the garden here in the house I'm in Caulfield. There was very little growing here when I moved in. So I would walk through the garden on the way to the studio, and the plants, the trees, the flowers. Yes, it's very nostalgic about the early days, but also my joy in pushing oil paint around and actually getting back into painting per se. And the atmosphere, I hope, is still there. The expression is still there. But I really started layering on oil paint. And again, it's, as you say, it's just the joy of being back in the garden, being back in nature, and having the time to indulge. I don't mean the word indulge, but to work back into the pleasure of using oil and pigment again.
Thanks, Tony. And you'll see some fascinating views coming up of your studio, both here in Caulfield but also Hong Kong and Beijing. So can you talk a bit about perhaps how your studio practice has changed here in Melbourne, and perhaps if lockdown has had an impact on the way you work?
Well, I no longer could get distracted by curating or having an art gallery or going to art openings, because lockdown just locked me into the beautiful space in Caulfield. So I've every day now I'm in the practice of getting up. I have chickens and I have a cat, so I feed them and look after them, and I'm in the studio. So I think in the last 3 years, but certainly in the last lockdown years, it's been absolutely focused on my art practice and being in my studio.
Thanks, Tony. And I've seen your studio and it is really creative and really interesting. So, Simon, your studio is in Ormond. It's part of your house and in your garden as well. So can you talk a bit about your studio practice and perhaps how lockdown has impacted or not on your working methodology?
Thanks, Dan. I think I'm a bit like Tony in a way. It hasn't affected me so much, although obviously getting prints and getting things done has not been possible. But it certainly has kind of refocused me as well. So not being able to do these things, going back into the studio, doing my some sculpture work, some design work, and a little bit of painting. I'm hoping to start on a new series of paintings soon. So that really kind of focuses the mind considerably, I think, in what you can do in these times. And it's certainly a very reflective moment as well. I find that I've got a lot of books and diaries, and just going through those to see things that, maybe 20 years ago, I made a little design or a little note to myself there, and coming back and thinking, oh, there's something there. I should pursue that. And often things jump through time as well. So it's extraordinary how things kind of come to the surface in some way of your mind, and you kind of reconnect with them, say hello, and you kind of continue that conversation.
And it's also an interesting time, I think, as you say, for reflection, but also creative ideas and concepts to emerge and, a spark of new concepts and creativity.
I think things can happen, as we know, at any moment, and just to be aware of that one or attune to it. And I think that's a really, for me, it's very important anyway, that you could just capture something or take something and And maybe in the past you thought, well, it was okay. But now when you look at it again, you think, oh, actually, there's something there I could really work with, because, we change as well. Our lives develop. We meet different people, circumstances change. And so we become different. We become more attuned in all sorts of different ways. So, yes, that time of reflection now, it'd be nice when it does change, but for the time being, I think it's a good time to think back.
Thanks, Simon. Well, we've reached the end of our conversation today, so I'd like to thank both Simon, Lloyd and Tony Scott for joining me for this fascinating conversation and insight into their work. We're really looking forward to seeing your exhibitions in the Council's gallery coming up soon, and when it's safe for us to open the gallery. And so thank you so much for your valuable contribution to today's online conversation and to our online program. I'd like to thank Leo Damiani, Charlotte Glen and the Council's Arts and Culture team. Just a reminder, this online conversation can be viewed on the Council's YouTube channel on our website, so please share with your friends and family. A reminder to our online audience to give us feedback, so you can provide comments about our online conversation via the Council's YouTube page. We look forward to your visit to the Council's gallery when the restrictions ease and we can safely reopen, and showcasing the amazing work of both Simon Lloyd and Tony Scott in their individual exhibitions in the gallery. So please stay informed about our gallery program via the Council's Facebook page and our website. And we look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.